So, let's go ahead and get started, ladies and gentlemen. So, again, these go with the cell PowerPoint notes that are found in week 11. Today's date, 11 10 number 2 cell notes. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we go through this, again, I just want to do a quick little introduction to cells. Now, it says jot down 2 to 3 things that stuck out to you. I don't know if there's a place to do this necessarily on the note catcher. So we'll go ahead and watch the video and we can discuss the things that stick with us when the video is through. Oof. All right, so that was a whole lot for first thing in the morning. All right, so somebody tell me one thing that you just saw in that video that kind of stuck out to you that you maybe didn't know or that you found kind of amazing. Yeah, your body literally has over 100 billion cells, which is insane if you think about it. Anything else that stood out to anybody? Just oh, I got something in the chat. A lot of beautiful cells. Yeah. I mean, we always talk about the diversity of life and we look at like the African savanna and we see all these amazing plants and animals and we're like, wow, and we're taken by their beauty. Um and yeah, like individual cells is just a plethora of just diversity and it's kind of amazing really how beautiful they are. For me, oh, I got something else in the chat. Yeah, they're so tiny, like 10,000 of them. Like 10,000 can fit on like the pin of a head of a pin. That's just insane to me. Um and the cool thing about cells is as much as we think we know about cells, there's so much that we still don't know. There were things, I mean, and I'm way older than you guys are, but there were things like when I was in high school, like back in the 1980s, that they thought they knew. Um, and as it turns out, they were completely wrong. So the beautiful thing about the science of cells is that it's still ongoing. Like we're still doing research on DNA and stem cells and how all of this can make our lives better. Anyways, to me, like that's kind of the beauty of science, the fact that it's always there and there's always something new. Um, anyways, I'm kind of nerding out right now, but that's okay. Come on. Next slide. There we go. All right. So we have a few things. If at the end of us doing these notes, and you have these essential questions on your note catcher, so these are the key things. These are the key things that we are trying to learn as we go through this lesson. The three tenets of cell theory, how the cell was actually discovered, biological levels of organization, how do prokaryotes and eukaryotes differ, functions of different cell organelles, and how do plant animal cells compare. This is basically what we're learning over the next couple of weeks. And we're not going to do all of these notes in one shot. This will kind of be like one of those things where we do like certain parts today and then we work on it and then we do another section of this notes and then we work on it some more. So until we are actually done with all of these notes, I'm going to ask that you don't turn them in. I'll probably go in and change the date on them in terms of their due date. I think I put them in for tomorrow, but that's not going to be the case. All right. So this is part one, the cell number one. And again, what you are going to be typing in is the red stuff. So cells are the basic building blocks of all living things. One of my favorite analogies that somebody gave yesterday as part of their vocabulary was that they said that cells are kind of like Legos because Legos are these little tiny building blocks for like when you build stuff in Legos, and cells are these little tiny building blocks, but instead of building up like buildings or space stations like you do with Legos, cells are the building blocks that build up living things, which I thought was kind of a cool analogy. They provide structure. Think of like your bone cells, right? Your bones create the structure for your body. They help to take in nutrients. They convert your nutrients into energy. So we've talked about all these macromolecules, how we need to take in this food into our bodies to create other macromolecules, but also to release the energy inside of them. And they carry out tons of other specialized functions. Um, Cells have inside them things called organelles. Organelles are like these little tiny itty bitty structures inside the cells that perform certain tasks in the cell. Like the word organelle literally means, if you take it apart, tiny organ. So kind of like your heart has a job of pumping the blood through your body, or the lungs have the job of taking in air and expelling your waste gas, kind of like your stomach has a job of breaking down various different food products as you are eating. So in your body, you have all these large organs that do jobs. Inside of a cell, we have itty bitty tiny structures called organelles that perform jobs. So there's that. So let's talk about the discovery of the cell. So that is a god awful picture of Robert Hooke, but that's okay. So 1665, this was like a long time ago. Robert Hooke improves a design for a compound microscope, and he looks at cork specimens um, of a plant. Cork, if you don't know, is the stuff in plants that is between the dead stuff and it's basically like right underneath the bark of a tree. That's where you find cork. So it appeared to him when he looked at a cork under a microscope, he saw all these little tiny empty chambers, and he called those cells because those little tiny empty chambers reminded him of cells in a monastery. So a monasteries where like priests and monks used to live. and they'd have these little tiny itty bitty, very sparse rooms. So that's why he called them that. Um, and then of course, right there, I hear somebody unmuted. Was there a question?
Yeah, so basically, like you said, that's on our bark. So technically, that's probably tree sap.
No, no, no. Tree sap. If you want to think of it as in terms of a human connection. So the bark of a tree would be like your skin, right? That's the outer layer. And then underneath your skin, we usually have a couple of layers of like very thin layers of fat that the sort of the thin, so like the cork would kind of be like the layer right underneath your skin or right underneath the bark. It's tree sap would be more like our, if you want to use a human connection, it would be more like our blood. So tree sap is used to sort of like transport materials throughout a plant. The way our blood is used to the way our blood is used to transport materials throughout our body.
Okay.
All right. All right, so this is Robert Hooke. Again, he is the guy that really discovers cells. And he discovers cells because he's able to make a compound microscope and he improves the design. About 20 years later, a guy by the name of Van Leeuwenhoek. What a great name. Uh, he is the first guy to discover single celled organisms. He does this by studying pond water and, disgustingly enough, the plaque of his teeth. So, yes, he literally scraped his teeth and took a look at the bacteria that hangs out in your mouth. Side note, back in the day, 1600s, dental hygiene wasn't what it is today. So I am guessing he had an awesome specimen coming off his teeth. And we're just going to leave it at that.
Black teeth.
Yes, back then, there was not dental hygiene the way that we understand it to be today. Yeah, so I'm sure it was gross. Now, taking a look at that little thing next to the thumb there, that was his microscope. Like, that is crazy. Um, Anyways, so that was one version of a microscope. And what he saw were these little itty bitty individual bacteria and protozoa. And he actually called them animalcules because he thought they were some form of an animal. Um, so again, we discover cells and now we discover single cell organisms. That's kind of huge because up until this point, like we thought that all living things we had to be able to like actually like see, like they were multicellular. And Van Leeuwenhoek basically figured out like no, like there are these little single cell organisms. Side note, this is huge in medical science for those of you who may be thinking about going into nursing or medicine or dentistry or anything like that, anything in the medical. Huge because this is the beginning of germ theory, by the way. Like prior to this, people thought like if you got sick, it was just because you did something bad or that, you know, the powers that be were mad at you. This is the first time that we can connect single cell individual bacteria organisms. This is the beginning of connecting that to illnesses. All right, so along comes this idea of, and there's a few other guys along the way. There was Schleiden, there was Swan, and there was Virchow as well. And I'm not sure why I did not include them into the presentation, but that's okay. We'll talk about them when we go through some other stuff later. Um, Other scientists, again, Schleiden and Swan and Virchow, over the next couple hundred years add more to this understanding of cells. And this gives us the idea of cell theory. Cell theory states three things, and it is a fundamental theory in biology. And again, theories are already proven. Number one, all living things are made of cells. And we know this to be a characteristic of life. We've already talked about this in terms of our characters of life conversation that we had back in September. Every living thing is made up of cells. That's piece number one of our cell theory. Number two in cell theory states that cells are the basic unit of structures and function in all living things. So, all things are made up of cells, and these are the basic unit of structure and function in all living things. And finally, number three, and this was the piece that Virchow did. Um, all cells, the new cells, are produced from previous cells. Because again, up until Virchow, people are like, "Oh, okay," and cells just happen. It's magic. And obviously that's not the case. We know now that there is something called cellular reproduction, and that old cells make new cells. All right, so that takes us through this idea of cell theory. So going back to our original question, the essential questions: what are the three tenets of cell theory? This is them. All living things are made of cells. Cells are the basic units of all living things. And of course, that new cells are produced from already or pre existing cells. All right, moving on. All right, so a little cell theory video. We'll go through our little dudes. Oh, hold on. Sorry. Sorry. There we go. Need to start over.
mistake of locking horns with one of the most famous scientists ever, Sir Isaac Newton. Remember when I said Hooke dabbled in many different fields? Well, after Newton published a groundbreaking book on how planets move due to gravity, Hooke made the claim that Newton had been inspired by Hooke's work in physics. Newton, to say the least, did not like that, which sparked a tense relationship between the two that lasted even after Hooke died, as quite a bit of Hooke's research, as well as his only portrait, was misplaced due to Newton. Much of it was rediscovered, thankfully, after Newton's time, but not his portrait, as sadly no one knows what Robert Hooke looked like. Fast forward to the 1800s, where two German scientists discovered something that today we might find rather obvious, but helped tie together what we now know as the cell theory. The first scientist was Matthias Schleiden, a botanist who liked to study plants under a microscope. From his years of studying different plant species, it finally dawned on him that every single plant he had looked at was all made of cells. At the same time, on the other end of Germany was Theodor Schwann, a scientist who not only studied slides of animal cells under the microscope and got a special type of nerve cell named after him, but also invented rebreathers for firefighters and had a kicking pair of sideburns. After
Sorry.
working on the beginnings of the cell, a bone of contention arose between them as for the last part of the cell theory, that cells come from pre-existing cells. Schleiden didn't only studied slides of animal cells under a microscope and got a special type of nerve cell named after him, but also invented rebreathers for firefighters and had a kicking pair of sideburns. After studying animal cells for a while, he too came to the conclusion that all animals were made of cells. Immediately, he reached out via snail mail, as Twitter had yet to be invented, to other scientists working in the same field, and it was Schleiden who got back to him, and the two started working on the beginnings of the cell. A bone of contention arose between them as for the last part of the cell theory, that cells come from pre-existing cells. Schleiden didn't exactly subscribe to that thought, as he swore cells came from pre-cell formation, where they just kind of spontaneously crystallized into existence. That's when another scientist, named Rudolf Virchow, stepped in with research showing that cells did come from other cells. Research that was actually, how to put it, borrowed without permission from a Jewish scientist by the name of Robert Mach, which led to two more feuding scientists. Thus, from teeth gunk to torquing off Newton, crystallization to swarm cells, the cell theory came to be an important part of biology today. Some things we know about science today may seem boring, but how we came to know them is incredibly fascinating. So if something bores you, dig deeper. It's probably got a really weird story behind it somewhere.
I literally love that because Newton, even though he was like this like amazing scientist guy, was literally super petty. And yeah, like she's right. Like there is literally nobody knows what Robert Hooke actually looks like because uh Newton was in charge of the Science Academy in England and had because of their like feud that they were having, uh he had every single one of Robert Hooke's portraits burned. So yeah, like people always try to pretend like back in the day, like people were all like civilized and whatever. No, like they were like super duper petty, just kind of like we are today. So human nature, I don't think necessarily changes. Anywhoosies,
That's true.
isn't that crazy? Like this was like literally like having Twitter beef 400 years ago. Like they were just going back and forth, basically insulting each other. And because Newton had more power, he like burned all the guys' pictures. So here we are, like all these years later. There's this guy that Robert Hooke, super important for cell theory, and we can't put an actual like known picture of him in a textbook anywhere because Newton burned all of his pictures, which is hilarious. I mean, it's super petty, but it's kind of funny. I mean, I guess if you're not a family member of Robert Hooke, it's funny. But okay, to me, it's hilarious. Anywhoosies, moving on past my crazy obsession with things that are petty. All right. So we are now at section 4, unicellular versus multicellular. Okay, so unicellular organisms are made up of one cell. Multicellular organisms are made up of more than one cell. As a general rule, unicellulars are going to be like your bacteria, your archaea, your protists, single cell organisms that carry out all the functions needed for life, right? So, all 8 characters of life, these unicellular organisms will carry out. Okay. Again, if you break the word apart, uni means one, cellular refers to cells. Literally, the word unicellular means one cell. Um, Cells of multicellular organisms, like yourself, like me, like your dog, your cat, the tree outside, if you are made up of more than one cell, then what we end up seeing is differentiated or specialized cells. So, for example, we have muscle cells that are specialized in energy production and movement, right? We have brain cells or nerve cells that specialize in the transmission of messages. You don't see that kind of specialization, obviously, in a single cell organism because it's a single cell. But if you get into a multicellular organisms, we do end up taking on differentiated or specialized functions for these different cells. You will also see structure and organelles that are related to each cell's function. And again, multicellular, we will see plants, we will see animals, we will see fungi. Hey, Harmony, why do you take a mushroom to a party? Because he's a fun guy. I know, but it's still one of my favorites. All right. So moving on to levels of organization. So, one thing that we see in the characteristics of life, ladies and gentlemen, is that all living things have some form or level of organization. And by the way, cells are part of that level of organization. So, when we talk about cells, ladies and gentlemen, and we talk about the levels of organization of a living thing, we're really going to start at number 4. Okay, so yes, there's atoms, and atoms make molecules, and molecules make organelles. That's great. But when we start talking about living things, we have cells. Cells get together and make tissue. So all the cells that are the same will get together and make tissue. So, for example, you might have a muscle cell, and all your muscle cells get together, and now you have muscle tissue. Tissues that create are do the same job get together and create an organ system. Okay, so they work together to do a function. So, for example, in our bodies, right, we have our muscles and our tendons that work together to create motion in our bodies. So, you have the muscular system. And then you get a bunch of different systems together, and that makes an organism. So, again, the level of organization, and again, atom, molecule, organelle, that's great. But really, when we talk about the organization of a living thing, remember the cell is the basic level of organization for all living things. We have cells, cells make tissues, tissues that are similar make organs, and organs make organ systems, and organ systems make organisms. All right. Issues or questions? All right. Moving on.
Good morning, staff and students. Please excuse this very brief interruption during the first hour. Due to some incidents that have been occurring in lunch, unfortunately, students are not going to be able to continue to play basketball in the gym during lunch. We're hoping to get back to that space. However, right now, again, due to some unfortunate behavior by your peers, um, that is just not going to be the case. So until we get that organized and scheduled appropriately, you are more than welcome to still eat in the gym during any lunch. However, you need to be sitting in the bleachers or at a table. Again, this is unfortunate, and we're hoping to move in a different direction. We encourage you to make sure that you're checking yourself and talking to your friends so that you are acting appropriately and we can get back to that space. Thank you.
All right. Now, I'm sorry. There was a announcement. I don't know if you guys heard it or not here in the building, so I had to kind of hush and listen to that. All right, ladies and gentlemen. So moving on into prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Where are we for time? I don't know what time it is. I'm just have my whole screen up.
It's 8:52.
And okay, so we have about 5 more minutes. All right. So prokaryotes and eukaryotes. All right, so there are a couple of different ways of classifying cells. One way to classify cells is into two very, very broad categories, depending on whether or not they contain a nucleus. Okay, there are prokaryotes, and then there are eukaryotes. Um, Prokaryotes, pro rhymes with no, right? So prokaryotes, no nucleus. So all cells do contain DNA, and the difference between a prokaryotic and a eukaryotic cell is that in a prokaryotic cell, that nucleus literally is just kind of floating around in the cytoplasm. In a eukaryotic cell, all that DNA is contained inside of a nucleus. So that is the main difference between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus. Eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus. Now, by the way, eukaryotic cells also have what we call membrane bound organelles. The eukaryotic cells are considered to be a more evolved form of a cell. Prokaryotic cells are considered to be a less evolved form of a cell, and they do not have these membrane bound organelles, but we'll talk more about that later. But the big difference, like the big, like glaring difference between prokaryotics and eukaryotic cells is that prokaryotics, pro rhymes with no. Prokaryotics, no nucleus. Eukaryotics, you rhymes with do. Eukaryotics do have a nucleus. All right, so we're going to spend most of our time focused primarily on eukaryotic cells, mostly because, in my opinion, they're a little more interesting. They have a lot more going on. Eukaryotic cells can be either multicellular or unicellular. Um, Eukaryotic cells have their DNA contained inside of a nucleus. They tend to be a lot larger. They tend to be a lot more complex than a prokaryote. As a general rule, eukaryotic cells tend to be anywhere from 5 to 10 times larger than a prokaryotic cell. Eukaryotic cells have a lot of specialized organelles. Again, these are usually tend to be membrane bound organelles, and their domain includes the animal kingdom, so animals, plantae kingdom, the plants, fungi kingdom, the funguses, and the protists. Now, protists are single cell organisms, but they are like tend to live like in pond water and things like that, so they tend to be like water bound individuals. Again, eukaryotic cells, you rhymes with do. They do have nucleuses. They do have membrane bound organelles. And this is going to be our last one for today. Oh, I forgot about this slide. All right, so organelles of the animal cell. All right, so we have a picture here. You have the same picture in your notes. These organelles each have a very, very specific job, specific function. So we are looking at, and again, these are some of the words that came up the other day in our Ed puzzle: ribosomes, endoplasmic reticulum, nucleus, Golgi apparatus, cell membrane, mitochondria, cytoplasm, centrioles, vacuoles. These are all important structures inside of a eukaryotic cell. And each one of these structures has a specific function. Much like every organ in your body has a specific function, every organelle in a cell has a specific specialized function. Again, you have this diagram in your notes as well, but this is a plant cell. Again, plant cells are eukaryotic, and we know that because right there we see the nucleus. If you see a nucleus, you know it has to be eukaryotic. Again, we see some of the same structures, but one of the different structures that we see here is a cell wall, and it should be here. Oh, there it is, the green ones, the chloroplasts. Okay, so these are some of the different structures that we see in plant cells versus animal cells. I want to stop here just because it's a good place to stop before we get into prokaryotics. Please do not turn in your notes yet. I'm not saying I'm not